In the 7th century, the Rashidun Caliphate had blitzed effortlessly through a weakened Eastern Roman Empire, and in the 3 centuries that followed, the Byzantines had constantly been on the defensive against Islam. But in March of 961, the imperial eagle flew proudly over the island of Crete for the first time in 160 years, symbolizing a turning tide. In our last episode, we covered the rise of Nikephoros Phocas and his conquest of the Islamic Emirate of Crete. In this episode, we will see the pale death of the Saracens continue his conquests against the Muslim world, riding a wave of glory that would see him ascend all the way to the imperial purple. Welcome to our second video on the Byzantine Reconquista. Listen, you can Reconquista Anatolia, but you can't Reconquista your lost time, money, data and comfort. The sponsor of this video, NordVPN, is the perfect solution to help you keep your data and passwords safe, your money in your pocket, and your comfort unceasing. It's easy to use, and with one click you can connect to more than 5,400 servers in 59 countries on Windows, Android, iOS, macOS, Linux, and more. NordVPN is also the fastest VPN provider out there. There are so many ways to use NordVPN, they're everywhere in our life. If you're looking for movies and TV shows not available in your country, just click on the map and access all content you might ever want. You're a gamer and the game you're eager to play is not available in your country or is geo-restricted, you're just one click away. Also helpful if discounts you're interested in are geo-locked. NordVPN encrypts all your traffic, so your internet service provider can't slow down your streaming speed. So, what are you waiting for? Support us, get 4 free months of premium VPN, and save 73% by going to nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals or clicking the link in the description. Don't forget to use our coupon code, KingsandGenerals. After the reconquest of Crete, Arab piracy in the Aegean was limited, and the coastal citizens of the Byzantine Empire enjoyed an era of security not known in centuries. On Crete, Nikephoros initiated an aggressive policy of re-Christianization, and the local Arab population was exiled, enslaved, or forced to embrace the cross. Many native Greeks who had converted to Islam were also forced to revert their allegiance back to the Mother Church. The triumphant Roman general sailed back to Constantinople with his army, where Leo the Deacon claims he enjoyed a classical Roman triumph in the Grand Hippodrome. But there was little time to bask in glory, as while Nikephoros had been preoccupied in Crete, battles had been raging along Byzantium's border with the Hamdanid Emirate of Syria. Since the mid-10th century, the war on the eastern frontier had been a fierce but indecisive stalemate. Various border forts had changed hands multiple times, but major territorial shifts were few. By 955, this conflict had become a duel of wits between two exceedingly capable leaders. Ruling from Syria was the wily and ambitious Hamdanid Emir Saif al-Dawla, known as the Sword of the Dynasty. His glowing legacy among Islamic historians paints him as an enlightened philosopher and daring warrior king. And under his rule, his capital of Aleppo became a center of learning and fine arts, with a skyline marked by palaces and aqueducts. From 945 onwards, al-Dawla's campaigns on the frontier kept the Eastern Romans on the back foot, establishing him as the hero willing to defend the Ummah from the infidels during a time when the Muslim world was divided in internal conflict. Meanwhile, holding the Byzantine line was Leofakas, the oft-forgotten brother of Nikephoros, who was every bit as martially capable as his older sibling. Leo had been dueling with the Emir al-Dawla in Cilicia with considerably little resources and manpower, especially during 960, when the cream of the Byzantine army was off with his brother in Crete. It was during 960 that Saif al-Dawla took advantage of Nikephoros' Cretan campaign to launch an invasion into the Byzantine theme of Kasyanon, which he was able to ravage with impunity. It is likely that al-Dawla's army numbered a massive 30,000 warriors, and as a result, the severely outnumbered Leo was unable to face him head-on. Nevertheless, years of being forced to defend with a weaker force had forged the younger Phocas into a master of asymmetrical warfare, and on November 8th, he set up an ambush at the choke point of the Adrossos Valley, where he fell upon al-Dawla's much larger army while it was squeezing through the narrow mountain pass, utterly crushing his Muslim foe. While the crafty emir managed to escape the battle, his ability to launch major offensive campaigns was curtailed. So when Nikephoros arrived with direly needed reinforcements to support his brother in late 961, the balance of power was set to turn decisively in the Romans' favour. Thus, in the spring of 962, with a large, motivated army and capable lieutenants at his side, Nikephoros began his invasions of Islam's Syrian heartland. His first targets were the Arab princes of Cilicia, who held a tenuous allegiance to Emir al-Dawla in Aleppo. Ever since the Hamdanid emir's crushing defeat at the hands of Leofakas, the Cilicians' confidence in the authority of Aleppo had plummeted. This only made it easier for the Byzantine army to march in and quash them piecemeal. Anazarbus had capitulated by February of 962, while Tarsus managed to rally a paltry force of 4,000 men, only to be crushed by Nikephoros' far superior host. It was around this time that a certain John Tzimiskes was rapidly gaining a reputation for military brilliance as a general under Phocas' command. This Armenian warrior was the maternal nephew of Nikephoros, and a descendant of the great John Corcuus. During his uncle's career, Tzimiskes would play a big role on the battlefield, and a huge one amidst the schemers of the imperial court. Throughout Cilicia, Leo, Nikephoros and Tzimiskes leveled Muslim forts, tore down town walls, and scoured the land. Nikephoros' aim was to create a wedge of devastated territory between Cilicia and Syria, thereby opening the path to the crown jewel of Syria itself, the Hamdanid capital of Aleppo. For all his cleverness, Emir al-Dawla appears to have fallen right into Nikephoros' trap. Rather than bolstering the defences of his capital, he departed for Cilicia to personally re-establish control of the region in the aftermath of Phocas' devastation. In all fairness, it was reasonable for him to expect that the Byzantines had no plans to attack Aleppo. Winter was approaching, and the emir was probably deep in peace talks with Nikephoros at the time. But this illusion of safety was shattered when in November, Byzantine forces smashed past the walls of Manbij, capturing the cousin of Emir al-Dawla in the process. The last major city on the path to the Hamdanid capital had fallen. There could be no mistaking it now. The battle for Aleppo was about to begin. From Manbij, the Byzantine force marched south, split between two columns, led by Nikephoros and John Tzimiskes respectively. Although sources on the composition of this army are thin, we can assume that, much like the host that took Candax, it was composed of soldiers from across the medieval Roman Empire, with Greek thematic troops likely marching alongside Slavic, Armenian and Scandinavian soldiers. The gulf in numbers between the opposing forces was considerable. Arab sources claimed the Byzantines marched with 70,000 men, while Emir al-Dawla, hastily rushing back to his capital to build a defence, could barely muster a measly 4,000. These numbers are probably dramatised, but we must consider that Hamdanid military power had been severely crippled by Leofakas at Adrasos just 2 years earlier, and most of al-Dawla's forces were probably improvised civilian militias rather than professional soldiers, so it makes sense that only a paltry sum of fighting men could be mustered to defend the Hamdanid capital. The Hamdanid response to the Roman advance was uncoordinated, to say the least. As the Byzantine march on the city had been entirely unexpected, Aleppo's defences were probably ill-prepared to weather a long siege. Thus, rather than bunkering down in his capital, Emir al-Dawla split his already small force into two contingents. Taking around 1,000 of his men, he deployed himself to the town of Azaz, just north of Aleppo, to form a vanguard, only to, for one reason or another, retreat back to Aleppo before he had engaged his enemy. Meanwhile, al-Dawla's lieutenant, Naja al-Kaseki, had taken the remaining 3,000 warriors to Antioch, where he intended to force an engagement with the Byzantines. However, when no army came to meet him, he circled back to Azaz, just in time to encounter John Tzimiskes' column of the Byzantine army. The Armenian general handily bested the smaller Arab force in open battle, but this skirmish was probably not particularly decisive, as it appears that Naja managed to retreat back towards Aleppo with most of his army intact. After these initial maneuvers, Tzimiskes rejoined Nikephoros, and together they brought the full brunt of the Roman army upon the walls of Aleppo. Lion-hearted even in the face of overwhelming odds, Saif al-Dawla seems to have sallied his 1,000 or so men out of the city to meet the Byzantine horde. We can imagine that a fierce melee likely ensued, but direly outnumbered and outgunned, al-Dawla's forces were routed and he was forced to flee east. Sources say he was doggedly pursued by Tzimiskes, but given that there's no record of his capture, he probably escaped. Meanwhile, it seems that Naja's forces realized the hopelessness of their situation and gave up the fight. With their leaders having abandoned them, the remaining authorities in Aleppo approached Nikephoros with overtures for a peaceful surrender. It seemed that at first the Domestikos was inclined to negotiate. Talks started well, but with a massive army at its doorstep, public order in Aleppo began to collapse, perhaps in the form of panic-induced riots. Ever opportunistic, Nikephoros took advantage of this chaos to abandon peace talks and storm the city walls, breaching them on December 24th. The contest for Aleppo was now functionally over, and the entire city was under Roman control, with one exception. The elevated citadel at the heart of the city held out against the invaders, defended by a contingent of Daylamites, an Iranian people known for being prolific mercenaries and fierce warriors. Nikephoros allowed his men to have their way with the city and its citizens, and a brutal sack ensued. The Domestikos did not attempt to permanently occupy the city, seeing as its citadel was still unconquered, and his army, inundated with loot, was anxious to go home to enjoy their spoils. After 7 days of carnage, imperial forces tore down the city walls and finally left, taking with them mountains of gold and silver, over 10,000 enslaved Aleppines, and a relic of the Holy Apostle St. John the Baptist. In the wake of their departure, a thoroughly thrashed Emir al-Dawla was able to return to Aleppo and attempt to rebuild the smouldering remains. The Hamdanid capital was still in his hands, but the power and prestige of his emirate were permanently crippled. The sack of Aleppo was a blow to the psyche of the Muslim world, and when word spread of its scouring at Christian hands, panicked riots erupted in Mosul and Baghdad, while calls for an organized jihad erupted from Egypt to Iran. But the Islamic realms were still hampered by division, and any aid that arrived to support the Hamdanid cause came too little, too late. Nikephoros returned to Constantinople in spring to enjoy yet another triumph, but once more had little time to bask in the adoration of the masses, as a new crisis had arisen. On the 15th of March 963, Emperor Romanos II had passed away at the age of 24, leaving behind his 5-year-old son Basil II as his principal heir. The period immediately following the death of a Byzantine emperor was always an extremely tenuous time, defined by intrigue and assassinations. Successful commanders like Nikephoros were particularly vulnerable during these interregnums, as their influence among both nobles and commoners was immense. For anyone seeking control over the throne, it was often easier to have these highly popular generals disposed of rather than risk them becoming a political rival. Currently, the most powerful statesman in Constantinople was a shrewd and pragmatic eunuch named Joseph Bringas, who had been the de facto power behind the throne during the reign of the late emperor. Bringas's chief goal was now to establish control over the child emperor Basil II. As expected, he immediately began to see Nikephoros as a threat, fearing the influence of the man whom the people honored with chants of Victor. To get this troublesome war hero out of his way, Bringas reappointed Nikephoros as commander-in-chief of Byzantium's eastern armies, and made him swear an oath that he would not rebel against Basil II, the subtext being that he would also not challenge the authority of Bringas. Nikephoros was then booted back to the east, out of sight and out of mind. However, this move backfired spectacularly, as Nikephoros was now surrounded by loyal soldiers who pleaded with him to make a claim on the imperial purple. on July 2nd with a certain John Tzimiskes as his main backer. The army declared Nikephoros to be their basileus and marched back to Constantinople to claim his throne. Thrown into a panic, Bringas locked down the city and declared Nikephoros a public enemy. But the Cappadocian general was more popular than the eunuch, and riots quickly broke out in the streets and alleys in support of the beloved war hero. Eventually, Bringas was forced to flee the city, and on August 16th, Nikephoros was acclaimed co-emperor of the Romans and protector of the young Basil II, who would remain junior basileus under Nikephoros' guidance. Nikephoros spent a year in Constantinople, putting the empire's domestic affairs in order. Those who had been loyal to him were awarded high positions. His brother Leo was made the imperial master of coin, while John Tzimiskes was given Nikephoros' old position of military commander-in-chief. Most importantly, Nikephoros married Theophano, the widow of the late emperor Romanos II, tethering him to the family tree of the imperial Macedonian dynasty, which lent his reign legitimacy. Nikephoros was still a general at heart, and spent most of his imperial tenure away from his palace and inside military encampments. In the spring of 964, he had returned to the Eastern Front. Easy pickings awaited him. The region was still largely devastated from his campaigns 2 years earlier, while Emir Seif el-Dowlah held only a shadow of his former power and was now faced with near-constant internal rebellions. At the head of 40,000 men, Nikephoros, Leofakas and Tzimiskes steamrolled through an already weakened Cilicia, and by the end of 965, the region had been firmly annexed into the Roman Empire. That same year, the emperor dispatched the patrician Niketes Kelkutsis to drive the Islamic presence out of Cyprus, which the latter did with ease. Nikephoros also deployed a significant amount of military manpower to fuel campaigns on his empire's western frontier, but his European campaigns were significantly less successful, as a massive army sent to reclaim the island of Sicily from the Fatimid Caliphate was crushed in a naval battle in the Strait of Messina in early 965. Over the next decades, the Fatimids would establish themselves as the Roman Empire's next principal Muslim rival. The Fatimids were not the only Western army Nikephoros had to contend with, for tensions were also bubbling with the Byzantines' fellow Christians in the west. From 968 onwards, skirmishes erupted between the Byzantines and the German Emperor Otto I across Italy. These conflicts ended inconclusively, but resulted in a growing rift between Latin and Greek Christendom. Back in the east, Nikephoros had begun to eye another prize, Antioch. This city had been under Islamic rule since the rise of the First Caliphate, over 300 years earlier. But before that, it had been one of the 5 most important Christian bishoprics in the Roman Empire, alongside Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. Needless to say, reconquering this historic place would be a fine feather in Nikephoros' cap. It was a good time to strike too. Seif el-Dowlah, long the wily antagonist of the Byzantine story, had finally succumbed to disease in 967, leaving his already crippled emirate more vulnerable than ever. After taking a detour to annex some Armenian cities in the east, the emperor marched south in 968, carving a path of destruction along the forts and cities of the Levantine coast, with the intention of isolating Antioch from any allies that might come to its aid. Given Antioch's symbolic importance to the Romans, Nikephoros wanted as little damage done to it as possible. To that end, he had a fort constructed in the city's hinterlands and placed it under the command of one Michael Botzes, who was ordered to starve out the Antiochenes through a blockade and explicitly told not to take the city by force. After this, Nikephoros returned to Constantinople. Botzes, however, was an eager commander in search of glory and reputation. Supposedly, when a defector named Orlax offered to show him a secret passage into the city, he leapt at the opportunity, breaching Antioch's defences before storming and capturing the city. No doubt the young general thought this would earn him the praise of the emperor, but nothing could be further from the truth. Nikephoros was furious, publicly denouncing Botzes and removing him from his generalship. In disciplining his rogue general, Nikephoros had miscalculated. Rather than affirm the sanctity of his imperial commands, he made an enemy for life. Bortses was only one man, but he was a symptom of the emperor's declining popularity. Nikephoros may have been a brilliant general, but this did not necessarily make him a capable head of state, and his domestic policies soon began alienating him from many groups he could not afford to alienate. Among these included the church, whose growing power over state land he had tried to curtail by forbidding them from opening new monasteries or receiving land donations from indulgence-seeking nobles. The soldier emperor was also beginning to lose the favor of the commoners. As a career general, Nikephoros seemed to always give preferential treatment to his soldiers, and was willing to turn a blind eye when they extorted Byzantine citizens for material gain. Additionally, the peasantry had spent the last few years being taxed dry to fund the endless wars. The list of the emperor's powerful enemies continued to grow. Among them was his own wife Theophano, with whom his relationship had been distinctly lacking in marital bliss. Perhaps his greatest falling out came with the very man who had proclaimed him emperor, John Tzimiskes. Sources are not clear on why, but at some point Tzimiskes had run afoul of Nikephoros, and the emperor had put the decorated Armenian general on house arrest. Although this imprisonment was reversed at the pleading of the empress, it was too late. Nikephoros had turned his most faithful ally into a bitter enemy. On the 11th of December 969, Nikephoros II Phokas retired to his imperial bedchambers as he did every night, but all was not normal. That night his wife Theophano had left the doors to his rooms unlocked and unguarded, allowing a shadowy figure to sneak inside with knife in hand. With one swift stroke, the general turned emperor, who had lived his life on the battlefield, died in his bed. The murderer was none other than John Tzimiskes. With the blood of his former friend and ally on his hands, it would be him who would replace Nikephoros as the Basileus of the Roman Empire. The life of Nikephoros Phokas may have been over, but our series on the Macedonian Renaissance of the Byzantine Empire certainly is not. In our next episode, we'll cover the reign of Emperor John I Tzimiskes, who in time would prove to be just as brilliant a warrior king as his predecessor, having to contend with resurgent Bulgarian Tsars and the Viking-descended princes of the Rus. So make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.